Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Sunday afternoon West Coast time space show program. And I am your host for the program, David Livingston. Thank you very much for tuning in. Um, I think we're going to have a really fascinating discussion, and I will tell you more about it in just a minute. But this is a full-length space show program, and we have a couple of programs coming up. Steve Wolf is back with one of his associates. I think her name is Elizabeth Chang, on a Beyond Earth programming and things that are coming in. And Hotel Mars is our friend Rick, again, National Security, Rick Fisher, talking about China and the U.S. competing for space championship. Frank, if I get his name right, Pietro Negro, and this is going to be a humanities and space program. Excuse me, and then open lines will be Sunday on February 15th. So that's what's coming up. I will be getting all of the programs caught up and archived by tomorrow, Monday. And we are honored to have with us today Dr. Scott Solomon. He is a professor at Rice University, actually a biologist and a science communicator, but he teaches ecology, evolutionary biology, scientific communication at Rice. His bio is quite long, so I'm not going to read it, but it is on the website, so you can check it out. He does have a new book, Becoming Martian: How Living in Space Will Change Our Bodies and Our Minds. Of course, this is highly relevant to space show programming. And he also talks about gravity prescription. And we talk about kids in space. Well, is that even possible on Mars or the moon or someday an orbiting big space station hotel? So we're really happy to have Dr. Solomon with us. And with us in the space show team is Marshall Martin, and then John Hunt, Dr. Sherry Bell, and our friend Fremont John, who we affectionately refer to, Fremont being Fremont, California. Scott, welcome to the program. How are you today? And thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
Introduce us to your work and your relationship to space, and also, uh, are we all going to become Martian, or is just the ones lucky enough or unfortunate enough to go there? How do you see that unfolding?
Yeah, that's the question if you ask me, the big question. So, well, look, my background is I'm an evolutionary biologist. So I did my PhD research actually studying ants in the Amazon rainforest. So took quite an interesting left turn at some point here to get to this topic, which happy to get into if we have time and if there's interest. But as an evolutionary biologist, I'm really fascinated by the idea of creating settlements in space. Because the idea is if we had people that were not just, going and traveling somewhere and coming back, but actually living their lives there and having children, that sets up a scenario where you could have people adapting to the conditions in space on Mars or wherever they are. So basically, I guess the longer version of the story, I won't, go too long on this, but I wrote a book about 10 years ago called Future Humans, which was all about the ways in which human evolution on Earth is still happening today. Of course, it's different today than it has been in the past and in ways that I think are interesting and important. But at the very end of that book, I thought through what are some possible scenarios for how our species might evolve in the future. Like, what is the ultimate fate of our species, Homo sapiens? And I looked at three scenarios. One is we go extinct. Obviously, I think we all want to avoid that fate if we can, but it's possible. Another is that we basically stay pretty much as we are indefinitely. But I point out that that's very unlikely because that has literally never happened to any species in the 3.5 billion years of life on Earth. So we shouldn't expect that to happen. A more likely scenario is that we change in some way. And how might we change? How might we evolve into a new species? Well, one of the scenarios that I mentioned just briefly at the end of that book was, well, if some people left Earth, again, that sets up a scenario where you would expect evolution. And we know that species on islands, isolated places with different environments, they often evolve into new species. That's why, Darwin was inspired by visiting the Galapagos Islands, and that's why biologists still go to islands to understand evolution. So basically, that was just a small part of the end of that book. But then after that book came out and I was, doing interviews and giving talks and things like that, that was the thing everybody wanted to hear about, right? People kept asking me, yeah, okay, but talk about space. What's going to happen to us in space? And of course, that, also coincided with around the time when a lot of things, as you guys all are very well aware, started happening in the world of space and space exploration, space science, that started to make a settlement somewhere beyond Earth look a little bit less like science fiction and more like something that we could actually see happening in the not too distant future. So I decided, all right, this is the right time to do a deep dive into this topic and really explore what can we say about what would happen to people living in space, not just the first people that go, but their descendants. How would they change over time? So that's what the book is about. It comes out on February 17th. And yeah, excited to dive into it with you guys.
Um, how do you make your assumptions since none of this is real? So I'm
Yeah,
always,
yeah, yeah,
I come from the business school side of things, but
yeah,
I'm always interested in how the researcher or the expert or the great thinker makes their assumptions about like what it would be like living in space. What I know you
yeah.
have some facts and
Hmm.
material to draw from, but of course we haven't really done it except in Leo and not for very long. So
Yeah.
what's your process for filtering out garbage and
Hmm.
bringing in things that are, I guess, as reliable as they can be for today?
Sure. No, I think that's a great question and an important one. So essentially, my approach was to first start with like, what do we know about how the conditions of space affect the human body? And I'm saying space generally, but as you point out, most of what we know is specific to Leo, to low Earth orbit. And so, we've learned a lot, of course, about what happens to the human body for relatively short duration, visits up to a year or so in weightlessness. In the somewhat higher radiation environment of space, and so that's kind of the starting point. Is what can we say about what happens to an individual person in those types of conditions? But then I get into like, well, what are the conditions on Mars? And I do focus on Mars. That is, I guess, one assumption that I make. Although I try to be clear about it, that Mars seems to be, if we were going to build a settlement, a place where people would go to live their lives and raise their families, that seems to be the most likely, at least first destination. And I try to be pretty open and clear about what the challenges are of doing that. So one of the things that I had the chance to do was to sit in on a session with the Perseverance rover team as they were kind of making their plans for where the rover was going to be sent on the next day. And so, I mean, it was fascinating to kind of see the process, and I described that in the book. But I used that as a way to talk about what do we know about what the conditions are like on Mars? How have we come to know that? So one of the things that I really try to do in my process of writing is not just say, here's what we know, but to sort of show how we know it, right? What is the process by which science happens? And I really try to make it about, I try to tell stories, and I try to tell stories about the people doing that work. So this, of course, was a lot of the fun of doing this kind of research for the book, was getting to go to, places where this work is happening, and interviewing and talking with the people who are, on the front lines of doing this work. So that was kind of part of the approach. The other part is to describe what do we know about how evolution works, basically, and this is really my background, my expertise, and so I talk about studies of islands and organisms, species that are living on those islands as a proxy for what might happen to people living on the islands that we call planets. So basically, I'm trying to sort of show people how we have learned the things that we now know about both how space affects the body and how changes happen over generations to any time a species gets, finds itself on a remote speck of land far from home.
If we're looking at living in space and what that might mean for humans down the road, um, and you're using Mars here for your example, but if I ask you if living on the moon or living on an O'Neill space station, if one existed, or at least something a little larger than the ISS, for example,
Hmm.
would the impact on humans be pretty much the same, which whatever the planetary surface is, or free space, or because Mars gravity is different than the moon, and both are different than free space, maybe the impacts would be different.
Great question. Yeah. So part of what I talk about actually is the things that we don't know. So we don't know, much about how partial gravity affects the human body because, of course, very few people have ever actually experienced it. I mean, 12 individuals walked on the surface of the moon and experienced lunar gravity for a short amount of time, a few days at the most. And we actually didn't collect that much biomedical data on how that was affecting them. So we have a little bit of an idea, but when we get into Martian gravity or other partial gravity, anything between weightlessness and 1G, the bottom line is we just don't know, and we can speculate, we can imagine maybe it's something in between the effects of weightlessness and the effects of 1G. But I actually try to really be clear about what are the limitations of our knowledge. But to answer your question more directly, I think a lot of the conclusions that I make and what I try to point out in the book is something that would be true no matter where we go. So factors like who you choose to send to establish a settlement matters a lot. We have this concept in evolutionary biology called the founder effect. And basically what it describes is anytime a new population is established, the founders of that population have like a disproportionate effect on what can happen to that population in the future. So, going back to the idea of islands, right? A new island pops up out of the sea, as a volcano or something, and the first, birds and plants that make it there, however they make it there, they're probably not going to have a lot of the, genetic diversity, a lot of the traits, a lot of the characteristics that were present in wherever it was that they came from. So you have this like reduction of genetic diversity that has a really big impact on the possibilities for how that population can evolve in the future. And that's something that would be true no matter where we go, whether it's Mars, whether it's Enceladus, whether it's a station at a Lagrange point somewhere. Like it actually doesn't matter because the same principle would apply. And there's other aspects that I get into of kind of how evolution works that I think similarly would be true no matter where we go. Of course, how you might imagine that our descendants changing, like what would be the ways in which future generations might be different from us, that could very well be quite different depending on what the conditions are, if it's Mars or if it's, say, a space station.
Now, if it was decided that we needed researchers on what living on Mars is going to do to humanity, and whether it's even possible, and they were going to send you to Mars as the one and only researcher,
Oh, no.
but you'd have a crew. You'd have a support crew.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So you're kind of like Harrison on his Apollo mission. You're the only
Right.
real scientist going there. What would your research agenda and
Mm.
daily schedule look like? What would you be trying to ascertain by having boots on the ground on Mars?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, I'd feel a lot of pressure to do all the things because, that's such a unique opportunity if I'm having to do all of it. So, I mean, there's basic questions that I think we all want answers to about what it's like there, what already exists there, the conditions, is there life, all of these things, right? And I would be wanting to pay attention to how my body was reacting and being affected by the conditions. But I think if I was there and I had a team and I was like, tasked with trying to collect as much information and learn as much as we can, one of the things I would really want to do is some experiments that would allow us to really understand the evolutionary changes that we could expect in future generations. Now, here's the tricky thing, and here's why I think we haven't done as much of these studies, as I point out in the book, to help us understand why do we have to kind of speculate about this stuff? Well, we haven't done experiments that allow us to look at multi-generational change in space because it takes a long time, and it's of course expensive to do that kind of research, on ISS or anywhere. And so it just hasn't been something that's really been prioritized because, for a lot of factors. So I would want to do something like there's a famous experiment in evolutionary biology by a biologist named Richard Linsky. And this is an experiment called the long-term evolution experiment. It's done using bacteria, E. coli bacteria, where basically, I won't go through all the details. I talk about this in my classes when I'm teaching evolution. But the basic idea is let's use bacteria as a proxy for any organism. And let's have a whole bunch of copies of genetically identical bacteria and see how they change over time, because they can have a generation in like 20 minutes. So you get to sort of fast forward the clock and see how do they adapt over time? What kinds of changes can you expect? I would love for somebody to do that type of experiment in altered gravitational fields, right? With higher radiation exposures. We could make some predictions about what we expect might happen, such as higher mutation rates from the increased radiation exposure. Radiation causing mutations. Mutations are the raw material for natural selection. So that gives a species opportunities to adapt to conditions that they haven't experienced before. And so one prediction that I make in my book is that evolution would proceed faster in space, including on Mars, than it does on Earth, in part because radiation exposures being higher kind of kickstarts the opportunity to create more variation. And so that's a testable hypothesis, right? So we could do an experiment that would actually see, okay, is that true for E. coli? Now, if it is, that doesn't necessarily mean the exact same thing would happen in humans, but it gives us the closest sort of proxy that we could do in a relatively short amount of time. So I think that would be my first study I'd pitch.
I see that you talked about some of these experiments that should be done. So maybe there's a chance that they're done on the ISS before it retires,
Yeah.
that it's a national government lab. And it sounds to me like some of these experiments are appropriate for the government, but we're replacing the station with 4 commercial stations.
Right,
And
right. Yeah,
it's
I think
not
it
the
would be
kind
great
of,
to do that.
this is not the kind of research that you do because there's no profit in it. So do you see this kind of research actually being done on commercial stations, or are we going to be without it?
Well, this is the kind of research that I would say. I mean, you're right. It's not profit-driven research, but it's basic science, and it would get us answers to questions that are at the heart of whether it would be possible for our species to be multiplanetary. If there's interest in having our species live in places other than Earth, in any capacity other than just as short-term visitors, then we need to know what will happen to future generations. And so I would argue this is a pretty important basic information for us to have. And eventually you'd might like to do experiments like that with other types of research organisms that are a little more similar to us. You could start with bacteria, move on to yeast, which have cells that are more similar to our cells, and then maybe move on to like rodents or something like that. And then, if you're starting to see the same kinds of patterns in all of these, that's an indication that you might be seeing general principles that might also be true for us. That's That's what I would love to see. And yeah, let's do it on ISS. Let's do it on any of the commercial space stations when they're ready to go. Let's do it on the moon when we have lunar bases. And we'll learn a lot about what life might be like for future generations, of humans if they ever leave.
So today we have proponents, strong proponents of living on Mars. So, I mean, Musk, Bob Zubrin, and others. I don't think they have any more information than you have on humans living on Mars, but they make it sound like it's a done deal, like we can live on Mars. I don't, Bob Zubrin, I've heard him say radiation's not an issue. It'd be like somebody in their 60s smoking an extra pack of cigarettes a day. I've heard him say that at conferences, give or take. And of course, we all know Elon's plan. But as I said, I don't think they have any better or more data than you have. Are they jumping the gun that it's a foregone conclusion that we can live on Mars? Are we being excited and then maybe being set up for a big letdown if we find out otherwise? How do you see the advocacy for this?
Yeah, so actually, this is a big part of the motivation for me for writing this book because there are people like some of the folks you mentioned who are very much encouraging us to move forward with these plans and have come up with a lot of detailed designs and ideas for how to get people there and how to create habitats and environments and agricultural systems and whatnot to be able to keep people alive. My starting point actually for researching this book was, what if they're successful, right? So for me, it's not about, my interest and my expertise is not about the technology to get us there or even to keep us alive. It's really, what should we expect to happen next? What would happen to the people living there? And that's where I think basically what I'm calling for here is at least as much, if not more, focus on the biology. So the technology would be necessary, but it's not enough, in my opinion. I think we need to also pay attention to our biology. And I say that in the broadest sense, right? So not just the physical things that are happening to our DNA and our cells, but also, the psychology. What happens to the mind? What happens to the emotional status of people living, so far from home and not able to engage in a conversation like the one you and I are having right now because of the time delays. Like, I think we need to understand all of those things in addition to, having the rocket technology and the ability to create a habitat that would keep people alive. So it's not so much that I'm not necessarily saying that they're wrong, that we can't get there. I'm saying let's give at least as much attention to what will happen if those efforts are actually successful.
So it seems to me like everything, including having children in space, pregnancy in space, for settlements and all of this, relies on on-the-job training. So is there any simulation? Is there any way to really get ahead of all of these questions and concerns by not doing it, by not
Yeah.
physically being in that environment? Let's roll the dice and see what happens.
I think we can actually learn a lot, by doing some controlled studies. So one of the interesting things that I follow in the book and describe in the book is there's a company from the Netherlands, based in the Netherlands, called Spaceborne United, that is attempting to basically study human reproduction by breaking apart sort of the different phases of reproduction, and I say by human reproduction in space or beyond Earth. So they have developed a device that is able to basically be an in vitro fertilization lab that you can stick on top of a rocket. And then it can spin at different speeds to simulate different gravitational fields. So the idea is we could look at the first few stages of, conception, fertilization, embryo development, in weightlessness, in lunar gravity, in Martian gravity, and then we can compare it to 1G, and we can do that in rodent cells, for example, with rodent embryos before doing that with human cells. So I think that's a very interesting example of a research program that will start to get answers to those questions. Because you're right, reproduction is, in my opinion, it's the one thing that could be a potential showstopper, right? If we can't have kids in space, if we can't reproduce beyond Earth, then there's no way we'll ever be multiplanetary. There's no way we'll ever do anything more than, send people out for some amount of time, but we'll always have to keep sending new people. So the reproduction is, to me, the central question. That is the central question here to whether it is indeed possible. And it's one of the reasons, again, I'm calling for more attention to space biology than has historically been the case.
I'll open it up to others who want to start to participate in the show if you have comments and questions. But are we close? If I ask you for the TRL, the technology readiness level for any of this to go to Mars and start living there, or just to try it, are we even close to a decent technology readiness level, or is this still so far away from us that we need a lot more information to make it safe?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is the technology to get us there seems to be rapidly advancing, right? I mean, we're all aware of that. We're all following the rocket designs and testing and all of that. So it very well could be the case that we see boots on the ground on Mars in the near term future, right? And in the next decade. But the idea of again of a settlement, of having people living there long term, that's where I just think it's not enough to have the technology. So we might even be at a point in a few decades when it would be technologically feasible to send people on a one-way trip with the idea of not coming back and raising their kids there and establishing a new human outpost in a literal sense. But I'm pointing out that we need to think through. I've talked about the biological questions. There's also ethical questions, right? And these are really important. I mean, is it okay to bring a child into the world if the world for that child is going to be a very dangerous, harsh environment? And by the way, we don't actually know if that child born on Mars would be able to come back to Earth. I think there's pretty good reasons to suspect that would be difficult. And so that gets into not only biological questions, but ethical questions about, whether that's an okay thing to be doing. So I don't say that we should never do it, but I think we need to know those things before we start boarding those rockets.
So just to be sarcastic for a minute, and I look around at children being born, I'll just put it in the United States. I won't talk about other countries. And if we're talking about, is it ethical to bring a child into this world? There are people deliberately getting pregnant and having children in environments that almost assure total destruction by early childhood through crime, drugs, through all sorts of stuff. And they know that. In fact, they're probably part of that. Is that ethical? And where are the ethics in bringing children into this world here on Earth? And why don't we apply ethics to that before we would apply ethics to having children born in outer space?
Well, those are tough questions, but important ones too. I mean, yeah, I think a lot of the issues that we would face in space actually do mirror or replicate questions that we have here on Earth. And it's actually one of the other things that I try to point out is that while some folks see moving to space as an opportunity to start over or create some kind of a utopia, I'm pretty skeptical about that. I think humans are humans, and we'll take our problems with us. So I don't really feel like it's a solution to our problems in that sense. But Here's what I would say. I think, yes, there are people living in all sorts of challenging situations here on Earth, no doubt. Um, but what we're talking about on Mars is, I think, orders of magnitude more extreme. I mean, we're talking about a situation where, a power failure or something like that means, instant death for everyone. I mean, this is, and then just the notion that people would not necessarily be able to leave there and go somewhere else, even if they had the means, like their body wouldn't be able to handle it. One of the things I point out is that it's not just about our physical bodies in the sense of our bones and our muscles. That alone could be a challenge, right? And this has been explored in science fiction, but the idea that a child born in a lower gravity environment might not build a skeleton that is strong enough to tolerate 1G. That's a familiar concept for, in The Expanse, for example, right? But I think there's more. I think there's also the idea that the immune system of a child born on Mars, where you'd only be exposed to whatever microorganisms we bring with us from Earth, which is going to be, I mean, we know we bring microbes everywhere we go, but we only bring a tiny fraction of all of the microbial life that we're surrounded by here on Earth. And when we are young and growing and we're exposed to all of these bacteria and other things, that's how we train our immune system. That's how our immune system develops and is able to fight these things off, and it's not an issue for the most part. But a child who's never been exposed to 99.9% of those things might come to Earth, take a deep breath of air, and get very, very ill. So that's another reason why I think we're talking about a sort of a fundamentally different type of ethical question when you're talking about bringing a child into the world on Mars. So, yeah, it's a tricky one.
If we flipped the constraints that you've been talking about and the risk factors, would it be reasonable to say, okay, if there are sentient extraterrestrials, even if they're on an exoplanet that is similar to Earth, they face all of these factors from their customary environmental conditions, whatever they may be, and they wouldn't likely be able to come here unless somehow they did the experiments to see if they could survive here. Is that a fair flip?
Yeah, I love that question because actually one of the things that I think is great is, I was mentioning science fiction earlier,
Uh-huh.
and, H.G. Wells explored this back in 1898 in The War of the Worlds, right? So the
Right.
Martians come down and their technology is too much for us. We can't stop them. But then what ultimately prevents them from taking over? It's bacteria. It's the microbes. They
Bacterial,
can't, yeah, they can't handle our microbes. Sorry for the spoiler alert if anybody's not read it, but,
yeah.
you've had time, to be fair. So
Should have read it in grade school
that's
you
right.
know,
It's a
had a real
classic.
good school. So
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think that idea is an idea that very well could apply to other organisms. I mean, I could put on my biologist hat here and poke holes in that argument if I wanted to. Like, if this is a form of life that has no connection to Earth life. It was an independently evolved form of life. It may not be able to be infected by Earth life. It might be, something fundamentally different. So, but I love speculating and thinking about those kinds of things. But I think it's not a question we can answer without knowing what that alien form of life would be like, but it is fun to think about.
Marshall, you wanted to talk?
Yeah. Uh, a year or so ago, I wrote a paper which I called Biosphere X, Y, and Z. X for developing on the ground, Y in low Earth orbit, and Z in deep space. And one of the things I was working on, just like the biosphere, was what animals you bring with you. And the question that you imply and bring up is, how are those animals going to be genetically changed over time
Yeah.
so that not only will we be successful in space, but the animals are successful in space? And then I toss in a little bit of dog theory about there was what 20 different versions of dog at about 1800, and 200 years later, there's what 100 identified uh,
Breeds.
breeds of
Yeah. Right.
dog,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you kind of go, well, okay, how are the animals going to change for
Yeah.
being in space with humans?
Right. Right. That's a great point. So anything we bring with us is going to change, right? I mean, that should be
Mhm.
the default expectation is that any species that leaves Earth and goes to an isolated environment with a different, an isolated place with a different environment is going to change. So our bacteria that are in our microbiome, they're going to change. If we bring, livestock with us, they're going to change. If we bring crop plants with us, they're going to change. So I guess the question becomes, is that change something that we are directing and controlling, or is it something that, gets away from us? So, one thing to think about, I explored this in the book, is I think there's an opportunity actually, if we were going to do this, to really minimize the amount of infectious disease that we bring with us. Yes, we'll take our microbiome with us. We'll have to take other microbes with us. I mean, plants need microbes to grow properly, just as one example. But a lot of the diseases that affect humanity today and have throughout history are diseases that we got from animals at some point, right? So you can think
Mhm.
about anything from rabies to, well, of course we're all familiar with now with COVID-19, but it's true of HIV. It's true of actually the majority of infectious diseases are the result of a spillover from an animal host to a human host, and those
Mhm.
animal hosts are pretty much always either a mammal or a bird. And so, and it's because, those mammals and birds are more genetically and cellularly similar to us. So it's easier for a virus or a bacteria or whatever to kind of hijack our, our biology, our biochemistry. So if we chose to not bring any other mammals or any other birds, we would not only be able to, not bring certain diseases when we go by, quarantining and careful, isolation of people, but we could prevent the evolution of new infectious diseases from animal spillovers moving forward. And that would actually be a tremendous public health win, right?
Mhm. Next question is, what animals would you pick that are going to be the stablest ones that would, you know, um, only mutate to our favor? That's
Yeah.
what we
Right?
ask.
Yes. Well, okay. So as I said,
You can guarantee that.
I would argue we should probably not bring not bring mammals and birds with us. So the bad news there is that means, first of all, we're probably not eating any meat. And I realize I'm saying this on Super Bowl Sunday, so no ribs, no barbecue. I'm in Texas, so that's a real hit for us here. And so that's one thing, but it also means no like pets, or no dogs, no cats, and that might be that might, that might be a deal breaker for a lot of folks that would have otherwise considered going. So what would I bring? I would argue that if we wanted to bring animals that are going to be a source of protein in our diet, the best bet we could do, the best thing for us to bring would be insects. We could bring crickets. We could bring mealworms. I'm a big advocate for eating insects here on Earth. I eat them myself. I've often prepared meals with insects for students to try. My kids have grown up having mealworms as a treat every now and then, and it's actually the majority of human cultures consider insects as a part of the cuisine. So those of us in North America and Europe that think that that's strange, we're in the minority actually. So there's good reasons to bring insects. They're healthy. You require much less in the way of space as well as resources. They don't need as much water. They don't need as much food. And we tend to not get infectious diseases from them. So, as I was saying, we wouldn't have to worry as much about that kind of spillover from, from animal hosts to us. So, yep, I'm a big fan of insect agriculture, both here and in space.
I when I wrote it, I did the pizza standard. If you can't make a decent pizza, humans ain't gonna go. So I said goats, chickens, mealworms,
Ah,
and fish.
okay. Yeah.
Jerry?
Sherry, did you have a question or a comment you wanted to make?
No, no, I'm just listening.
Um, in terms of insects on the practical side, if you're going to go to the moon or someplace for a 2-week holiday and you look at the suggested menu and it's flavored insects of some kind or another, I think that might kill your tourism business unless Earthlings transform their way of thinking about the Earthlings with money and the resources to go to the moon for a two
Yeah.
stay transform their thinking on what they're willing to eat. Because culturally, I don't see too many specials in the market. Insects where I shop.
Yeah, like I said, we are in the minority here in the U.S. and in a lot of Europe. I will tell you, one of my favorite foods that I have ever eaten anywhere. I love to travel. I love to try new foods when I travel. I had a dish one time in Mexico City in a very high-end restaurant that has become one of my favorite foods in the world. It's called escamoles, and sometimes known as Mexican caviar. And it's actually the larvae of ants that make their nest in an agave plant. And one of the cool things is that they can harvest this sustainably because you just open up the nest, you scoop out some of these larvae, saute them in butter and this flavorful herb called epazote, serve that on a tortilla with some guacamole, and it is, I'm not even joking, this is an outstanding meal. If you didn't know what you were eating, you would just eat it and be like, my God, that's delicious. So, hey, if I could have escamoles on the moon, I'd be a happy guy.
What's the calorie count? What's the calorie count on that?
Well, it's the butter that probably gets you on the calorie. No, it's pretty healthy. I mean, actually, if you compare insects with other kinds of animal protein, beef, pork, chicken, anything like that, it compares pretty favorably. It's generally got similar protein levels, lower in fat, high in minerals and vitamins. So it's quite healthy, generally speaking. Yeah.
What would the effect of eating an insect diet of some sorts in space be on human reproduction?
Ooh, on human reproduction. I don't know if there's any studies that have looked at the effect on human reproduction. One thing that's interesting is it would affect the microbiome. We know what we eat affects the kinds of bacteria and other microbes that live in our guts, right? And, vegetarians and vegans have a somewhat different microbiome than folks that eat meat, and so I've pointed out that a vegan diet might actually be really the way to go if you're talking about, say, a Martian outpost or a Martian settlement, just because it's more efficient, it's more energy efficient, right? If you're growing plants and then feeding those plants to livestock, even if it's insects, you're losing energy in along the way, right? And only 10% of the energy from one food source makes it into the next food source, kind of going up the food chain, the food web. So the most energy efficient way to get your calories is to eat plants. And that's true anywhere. That's true on Earth. But if we're in a space settlement environment where energy is at a premium and we're trying to conserve resources, eating the plants directly is probably the most efficient way to go. But yeah, what you eat does affect your microbiome. Don't know if that has any effect on your reproduction that I'm aware of, but it does kind of affect your biology. We know the microbiome affects all aspects, or at least many aspects of our lives. So it's interesting to think about.
Might affect your mental condition too, I would imagine if that's what you're eating. But we have a lot of talk going on about planning missions to Mars. So, and there are people actually working on how you get to Mars. So my question is, are you aware of any of these real mission planners, not the weekend mission planners and the space advocate mission planners, but the people really entrusted to kind of figure this out and do it? Are they thinking about some of the issues that you're talking about, like food and are they planning for insects, or are they planning to have NASA prepared foods go up on every mission? How are the people actually planning for going to Mars, dealing with these issues?
Yeah, so of course, NASA's Artemis plan is has the long-term vision of going to Mars, and so I have talked with folks there about kind of where things stand currently, closely following the Artemis 2 launch coming up around the corner here, and with an eye towards the ultimate goal of sending people to Mars. So I know from talking with folks there that food is a big part of what they see as a challenge to getting people to Mars, in part because given current propulsion technologies, you're looking at about a 2.5 year round trip mission, right? 6 to 9 months or so to get there, but then you got to wait for the orbits to realign before you can send a return trip. And so you're talking at the moment of sending people with a stable supply of food, shelf stable foods to last 2.5 years. And not only are there challenges that come with just the health aspects of eating prepackaged foods for 2.5 years, but the psychological aspects, right? Who wants to eat packaged foods exclusively for 2.5 years? The astronauts always talk about how excited they get when there's a resupply mission to ISS and they can have some fresh produce for a change. It does a lot to the to your emotional state, which I can relate to that. So I think from what I've heard, that is really an important consideration that people are looking at when it comes to what will it actually take to send people to Mars and do it in a way that is going to be successful, enjoyable, even, right?
Would would you go if you had the chance?
I've been asked that a fair number of times recently, and I have to really think about it because look, I'm somebody who loves to travel. I love to explore. I mean, this is the ultimate kind of adventure travel, right? And so, yeah, a big part of me would absolutely want to go. I don't know if I want to be on the first trip, but I really would love to go and experience what it's like to travel through deep space, look back at the Earth getting smaller and see, the red planet getting larger and larger, and then get to actually touch down and explore it. An incredible adventure that would be. But I want to know I'm coming back home. I'm not one of the folks, and there are many. I've met many people who would gladly sign up for a one-way trip to Mars. I like Earth too much to agree to that. Too many people I love here on our planet to be willing to leave it permanently. But I'd love to go on an exploration trip if I knew it was reasonably safe to do it.
Hey, Scott. I want to address the elephant in the habitat,
Okay.
which is reproduction in space. So Musk, says he wants to have a city on Mars by mid-century, and millions of people. And the National Space Society has a definition of space settlement as biologically self-sustaining, meaning we have to have children there. So Musk is dealing with the infrastructure to get us there. I'm not sure he's he's smart. I'm sure he's thinking about this, but we really need to do mammalian reproduction experiments in a variable gravity environment in low Earth orbit so that we can get an answer to this question. We already know the microgravity issues. I posted a recent paper that came out last week on the ethics of reproduction in microgravity. Um, and that's on David's blog for this show. I don't know if you saw that paper, but determining the gravity prescription is if we can, have babies in Martian gravity or even lunar gravity should be a really high priority. And like you say, it takes multiple generations. So Spaceborne is working on this. I don't know what their timeline is, or even if they have mammalian experiments planned, because it seems like they have just a really small setup for embryo studies. Uh, so the VAST is working on artificial gravity space stations for their roadmap. I don't know where they have plans for mammalian reproduction studies. I'm just really concerned about this. So, what are your thoughts on that? Have you addressed that in your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I do address it. I have a whole chapter actually called "Space Babies," all about the many of the challenges that you're pointing out. And yeah, as I was saying before, I followed Spaceborne United pretty closely over the last several years now, and yeah, they seem to be one of the few organizations that is trying to sort of like push this forward. So my understanding is that their current plans do involve rodent embryos. So looking at whether you can fly some rodent sperm and oocytes and follow them through the early stages of cell division, embryo development, bring those samples back to Earth to a fertility clinic and sort of see if they are viable as just a first step, right? But yes, using rodent models, using a mammalian model to be able to see is this possible? Because there have been some studies, as it sounds like you're aware of on ISS. Fish, for example, the Medaka fish that were done some years ago, and it seemed to go okay. But there's other studies looking at like sperm motility and things like that that do show evidence of altered activity from lower gravity. But yeah, like you said, we need to know partial gravity, right? So sure, weightlessness might be a problem, but maybe 1/3 G is fine. We just don't know. So I think we do need to know those answers. I say that in the book, right? I say these are things that we have to know answers to before it makes sense for us to be building settlements. So. I'd love to have a conversation with Elon about how much he thinks about this stuff. My sense is that it's not their focus. They're focused on engineering, but these are all parts of the equation that we need to have answers to if we're truly going to live out there and not just go visit.
Scott, where we are in 2026, and we talk a lot about space settlement. So, from your perspective, lay out the steps we need to take in February 2026 to make space settlement real. Because I'm almost 80 now, and the show is 25 years old, and the talk and the advocacy and the rhetoric it's not tamed down. It's gotten more sophisticated, but it's that old commercial. Where's the beef? So what are the steps to make space settlement real from where we are today, and bypassing all the talk and the BS and the chatter and the advocacy? What we have to have happen first, second, third, when, timelines, what do we have the tech for? What do we not have the tech for? How do you see that, at least get us started?
Wow, that's a big question. So, I mean, I guess here's what I would say. What I would say is that um, there are things that we need to be pursuing in parallel. It's not like, we can do one thing and then start pursuing the next thing. I think if people are serious about wanting to establish a settlement on Mars, we need to, of course, have the technology to get us there. That is, being developed by various organizations, SpaceX among them. But in parallel, we need to be doing the kinds of biological research that we've been talking about. We need to be looking at reproduction. We need to know is it possible to have babies in space? And at the same time, we need to also be exploring the ethical challenges. One thing we haven't really talked about yet in this conversation is, is it a good idea to be thinking about making genetic modifications to the biology of people that would be living on other worlds? Should we, use CRISPR gene editing, for example, to improve the ability of people to tolerate higher radiation, or to be able to build a skeleton that is going to be robust even in a 1/3 G environment? There's a bit of research that's happening in that area. I described some of it in the book. But I think we need to explore that and understand whether that is something that is safe, whether that is something that is, has unintended consequences, because it may be that sending people into these environments is just so hazardous that it would be unethical to not make those kinds of manipulations, right? And so, if that's the case, we need to be ahead of the game on the genetics, on the ethics, and all those things can happen at the same time. We don't have to wait for the rockets to be, ready to go before we first start doing those types of studies. So, I think if people are serious about this, that we need to be doing all of the above. We need all of that research happening simultaneously. I think we'll learn a lot from the missions that are already planned. I mean, Artemis is going to be a great opportunity to collect a lot of biomedical data that wasn't collected during Apollo, right? The Apollo astronauts had very little instrumentation on them that allowed us to learn about what was happening to their bodies in lunar gravity. We have the opportunity now to learn a tremendous amount about what's going to happen once you get out, beyond the magnetosphere. So, I think we are poised to answer some of these questions, but we need to be investing in the research to do all of these things in parallel before it makes sense for us to be moving forward with any plans for settlement. I don't know what that timeline looks like, but it will be faster if we can do that research now.
Are we investing in that research in any meaningful way, to
No,
your knowledge?
Not nearly enough. So I think we are not yet investing nearly enough, particularly in the space life sciences research. There is some happening. NASA has a human research program that does some fascinating and important work studying a lot of these things. But it's a relatively tiny fraction of NASA's budget. And we need to be doing this in other ways too. And it's not just the U.S. Other nations can do this too. China is really big on trying to expand into space, and big on genetics research as well. And they very well may be making some of the advances that we're talking about. So if the U.S. wants to keep up in this, we need to be investing in that too. But it's also important for us to share information and collaborate to the extent that we can.
Most
I
of
have a question
NASA's
here that's a little
research.
bit further afield than this. It's just a little out there, but because it's way beyond our physical or technical possibility at the moment. But if we could get into interstellar space and actually go to planets that actually had a biosphere, let's say somewhat similar to Earth in terms of carbon-based life form, temperatures tolerable to us, what do you think would happen if a traveler from Earth were to go into that environment, not bioprotected, just like they do in Star Trek? They just get, it's not necessarily beamed down, but they land and they go out into that environment. Would the biosphere be so inhospitable that it would be unbearable, or would it be neutral? What do you think about that? Or have you ever
Yeah.
thought about that?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I co-taught a class last semester on astrobiology with my colleague Luis Campos, who's actually a science historian and an
Hmm.
expert on the history of astrobiology. And we had some fascinating conversations with our students about all sorts of scenarios. One of the assignments that we gave the students was they were working in groups, and each group was assigned a different hypothetical planet, an exoplanet with different physical conditions, and they were tasked with
Hmm.
thinking through how life might have developed, evolved on that world, and then ultimately what would happen to people, us, or people from Earth who came and visited that environment. It's exactly what you were asking. It's how would they impact the ecology of that world, and how would the ecology of that world potentially pose a challenge to us as humans. So it was actually fascinating to think through. The students are, these are real smart students who are applying what they learned in this class. And we got to kind of see through their eyes, kind of thinking creatively, but also applying what we know from ecology, from evolution, and from planetary science to these different scenarios. So yeah, I mean, I think there are ways in which we could imagine that going well and us being able to kind of tolerate those conditions and survive there. And there are certainly scenarios in which it really does not go well and becomes an extremely dangerous kind of situation. Not necessarily immediately, though, right? It could be sort of the slow, you know,
Hmm.
things like I've focused on infectious disease a lot, but there's also we haven't talked about cancer very much. I mean, this is a real
Hmm.
challenge to anyone exposed to higher radiation environments. But it's not only radiation. There's all sorts of ways in which hazardous environments basically damage our DNA, and that can lead to cancer. So, yeah, I
Chemical.
mean, yeah, exactly right. Yeah, sure. Yeah, anything that's a carcinogen, right? Is what So are there other carcinogens out there on other worlds? Quite possibly. We don't know, but it's a fascinating thought experiment. I loved it as a teaching tool because it allowed our students to really think through like applying what we know from Earth to different scenarios. Well, what if the gravitational field is different? What if there's the composition of the atmosphere is fundamentally different? What if we're not talking about carbon-based life, right? How does that affect, So yeah, it's a fascinating thought experiment. And it was really fun to see the way the students explored it and leaned into it.
And one thing Marshall was talking about right at the beginning before he got on the program was the idea of the pollen level. This thing's not may not like active virus or germs type thing getting in you, but just the environment of all the different thing biomatter that's in the air that we're in here, and you're in a totally alien one. Breathing that in, and that could have a lot of effects.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, even just the physical effects of getting particles in your lungs, right? I mean, this is going to be a risk for people on the moon, right? We know that
Yeah.
the regolith is sharp,
Mhm. Yeah.
and can be hazardous to your lungs if it gets in there. So who knows what else is out there?
Right.
May I address the allergies a little bit more? And that is uh, what is in the pollen grains that you actually have an allergy to tends to be a protein. And how many different possible combinations of protein are out there? It's thousands. Well, we
Yeah,
only use about 23, but no, I think they upped it to 26. Anyway,
amino acids. Yeah, right.
yeah,
Hmm.
and it's kind of like you go to a totally new environment and you can get whacked with all sorts of things. And then you have insects and mice and so on like that are bringing in things that you're not used to, and you can get surprised. I get surprised every year, and I know what
Yep.
I'm looking at.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, and what you're bringing up is the complexity of ecology, right? And this is what I
Mhm.
try to emphasize when I'm teaching students about this. We don't even understand all of the interactions among the organisms that live in even the simplest environments on Earth. It's so complex, and it's constantly changing. So yeah, if we want to be able to predict the ecology of other worlds and how we will interact with them, it would be a great idea to really explore and understand our own planet's ecology as best we can, because I'm sure we can apply a lot of those lessons to other worlds too.
John, did you want to say something?
No, well, I just wanted to comment on Scott's earlier observation that NASA has a life science group that's looking into this type of research. It's all microgravity. It's not variable gravity at all. That's not their priority.
Hmm.
They don't care. They don't care about reproduction in space, and they just want to keep astronauts alive on the trip out to Mars, and that's microgravity, and then you know keep them strong enough to finish their mission. They're not looking at reproduction at all.
Yeah, I know. I've talked with a lot of folks at NASA about this, and the individual folks are often quite interested in it. But as you say, it's not a priority for NASA because it's not part of their near term goals. I would say I think lunar gravity is something that they're looking at now because, of course, of Artemis, right? But yeah, Mars gravity is not yet an immediate short term plan. So, and yeah, you're right about reproduction.
It would seem to me for an immediate short-term plan, I never hear anyone talking about this, is the advancement of our medical care to treat conditions that happen in space. Because for sure, stuff is going to happen in space where people are going to need to be repaired, so to speak, or
Yep.
treated, but I never hear anybody talking about what are the advancements in medical care for, say, the moon or Mars. Can we fix a person who has a problem, maybe an undefined problem, given what little we know on Mars? Will there be any medical care for this person? How do you see the medical care for the people developing and moving forward?
Yeah, this is actually something that has been fascinating being here in Houston, where I live. There is actually,
Trish,
uh, yeah, we have Trish, and there's, Baylor College of Medicine here has a program in space medicine. Of course, there's the flight surgeons at NASA at JSC. So yeah, I have heard a fair amount of discussion about how to treat different medical conditions. Of course, we just saw the first instance of astronauts having to be, returned from ISS because of a medical situation. But of course, yes, going deeper into space, that won't be as feasible. So there's been a lot of conversations. I've talked to some folks in this field about how, having to automate procedures or having to make sure that crew and multiple crew members are trained and equipped to perform these procedures. Potentially without being able to have a real-time conversation back to mission control. They might just have to be, self-sufficient. Certainly if they were on Mars, that would be the case. So I think it is really an important consideration, not only for the crew that we would be thinking about for, the first few missions, but if going back to our conversation about space settlement, now you're talking about having children. You're talking about having, older folks. That is going to involve all different sorts of medical challenges. And so, of course, they would have to know how to deal with that. That can't be an afterthought. It has to be built into the mission plans. So those types of things, are not, of course, what NASA is currently focused on. But folks in the field of space medicine that I've talked with are starting to think about these things, and it seems like they have made some advances. There's more ability to bring medical equipment up into space than there used to be, but of course, still some things you can't bring up to space that you'd have in a clinic or a hospital.
does it need to develop in parallel with our ability to go there and address some of the other issues we've been talking about today? Or can we still go and let medical care lag?
Well, I think medical care for the folks that are going has to be built in, right? I mean, you can't send people out there without having any plan in place for what to do if one of them, has a medical situation. I think thinking about like, specialized care for, say, infants and young children is, not going to be a concern until people are having families up there. But yeah, we need to know about those things before it makes sense to allow people to be raising a family beyond Earth.
Doug, you wanted to say something? You're muted. We can't hear you.
Doug Plata here. I'm a physician. Let me just mention a couple of things back on the, actually on the medical. I actually did a presentation on providing medical care in the different phases of a growing base. And sort of the key takeaway I had is that we want to be able to anticipate what the medical needs are with the different phases of base/settlement, and to be able to sort of push people and medications and equipment and habitats to the front of the line, so that by the time we start getting private settlers who may be bringing their old age diseases with them, that we already have the endocrinologists for the diabetics. We have the surgeons and the equipment, everything. So I think with proper planning, we can be prepared. Back on the point of reproduction, a couple things I want to mention, and that is Spaceborne United. They've actually stated that they are looking at about 2055 is when they want to be ready to be able to address human reproduction off Earth. I personally think that's a big mistake, because I think from a probability standpoint, I think there's going to be enough people on the way or on the surface of Mars by that time that I think births will have already happened. So I think I advocate a much more accelerated series of animal studies to be able to try to get to the true artificial gravity prescription well before that time, because I think we're going to need it before then. And finally, to what extent do you take into account as an assumption that there's going to be the equivalent or an actual Starship fleet in which we're not going slow, we're not doing some exploration in small numbers of people, but there will actually be a fleet of fully reusable starships, and large numbers of people will be going to the moon and Mars? To what extent do you take that into account?
Yeah, well, as I said a little earlier, I think, my starting point for the whole conversation is like, what if they are successful, right? So I think that it would be necessary to send a large number of people if the goal were to, actually create a settlement that were going to be successful. The larger the number of individuals in that starting population, the more likely it is to be successful. And as I describe in the book, it's also really important to try to create a diverse starting population, because particularly genetic diversity of that starting population is an essential component of how likely it is to succeed in the long run. So it would take something like a fleet of of starships or something comparable in order to be able to get that size of a starting population. I mean, you're looking at minimally 10,000 people, but that's probably not even enough. So yeah, and of course it matters who they are. So yeah, I think I describe a lot of that in the book. It's the kind of thing that I think is. The fact that those rockets are being developed and tested now was part of my motivation for actually writing this book in the first place, because, I'm intrigued by what happens next.
Yeah, let me just say, in terms of the minimum viable population genetically, I don't think it's 10,000. I don't think that's what the data supports. And just think about it from a historical standpoint. Was Easter Island really populated by 10,000 unique individuals, unrelated? I don't think so. I think the minimum viable population is more in the low single-digit hundreds of people. But if you were to have, for example, frozen embryos that are specifically selected for genetic diversity, you could have many generations of people intermarrying before you start getting the homologous chromosomes pairing up.
Yeah, so you're bringing up sort of these really interesting considerations of like, not just number of individuals, but the genetic diversity of those individuals. And
Yeah, yeah,
then, exactly. So a lot of assumptions that go into it, but you could have a smaller in number of individuals if it is a very, heterogeneous, right? Genetically heterogeneous population. But yeah, you also want like, diversity of skill sets and
right.
whatnot, obviously. So yeah, there are a lot of important considerations there. Yep, great
A lot of
points.
fun. Yeah.
I want to point out an interesting point that you and Doug kind of brought up, and that is who is going to be the starting people? And right off the top of my head, I went little people with little food requirements, you know, subsized people would be the best because if they're in a space station and you have a 7 foot guy versus a 4 foot person, wait a minute, that's a big difference in comfort room and the size of beds and engineering and so on. Gets very interesting. So what
Yeah.
would be some of the genetic characteristics of the starting population that would you think would be successful?
Well, basically what we see from evolutionary theory is that it's less about what those characteristics are and more about the just total diversity, right? So the more variety that you have, the more opportunity there is for natural selection to be able to operate, and the less likely it is that you get these genetic diseases that often are associated with recessive alleles, and that's why you have issues often with inbreeding. But what I would say, you brought up size. This is actually a fascinating topic because one of the things that we see quite often with the evolution of island populations is that
Mm-hmm.
species change size. You think about giant tortoises, but you also see things like, pygmy elephants that evolved on islands all over the world. And we know that there
Homo
were even
florensis.
exactly Homo floresiensis, the hobbit that we're not supposed to call a hobbit, but is basically we now know that there are two different species of small-bodied hominids that evolved on islands. One on
Mhm.
Flores in Indonesia, and another one that was discovered more recently in the Philippines, Homo luzonensis. So this seems to suggest that humans, much like other species, change body size when we are isolated on islands. And being small does have advantages. It's not only more
Mhm.
comfortable, you require fewer resources. You don't need as much food
Mhm.
in order to survive. That could be a real advantage in a resource limited environment, especially at first. So, yeah, I think small bodied individuals, whether you choose to only send small people or whether they would evolve over time to be smaller or
Mhm.
both, could all be, part of the story.
Mhm. And
I
you
guess I'm out
earlier
of luck
talked
at
about
6'5".
vegetarianism, and could you find an appropriate group of people that are stay healthy and productive for a long time, being pure vegetarian? Uh, that would be a real trick right there to find the appropriate starting population.
Well, the most populous nation in the world is India, and they're largely vegetarian. So, it's definitely doable. But I think you basically want to cast as wide a net as you possibly can. I think you want to sort of, there's certain characteristics that sure you might want to look for. Who are the folks that are the most, resistant to developing, cancers? So,
Mhm.
DNA damage repair, radiation responses, like these types of things that might make people sort of predisposed to being better at tolerating these conditions might be good to
Mhm.
include. But again, we could also look at, well, what are the genes that are associated with those conditions? And is that something we can equip people with? Can you, do a simple gene edit that would sort of equip people with a patch, so to speak, that would allow them to have those characteristics. So those are conversations we need to have. I'm not necessarily advocating for it, but I think that it is something that is becoming feasible to do. We're already seeing CRISPR-based gene editing therapies that are FDA approved, for example, for treating sickle cell disease. So it's possible to do these. We need to understand the genetics behind the conditions, and we need to know that those treatments are both safe and effective. And as that technology advances, it might be possible to do that. But that isn't a substitute for trying to include a genetically diverse starter population. So it's more the merrier kind of a thing, in my opinion, as far as sort of like casting a wide net and making sure that you're not only sending a tiny subset of human diversity if you want to have a successful settlement beyond Earth.
If I might interject here, it seems to me, I think from a probability standpoint, the selection of who's going to go is probably going to be first and foremost based upon who has the deepest pockets to pay for those first seats. And I think governments have the deepest pockets. And if you see what sort of people do they send to space, they tend to not be, selected for genetics or small people or anything like this, but they tend to be just very fit, very athletically fit individuals, astronauts. And I don't see any particular reason why that's going to change. And when you have a really large payload capability with, reusable fleets and be able to do TMI on 120, 150 tons of payload, plus also you can do ISRU, like growing your own food at destination. I'm not sure that it's going to be a really constrained environment initially, nor should it. I mean, we should try to work to make it more abundant as possible. And then after the government phase, when you get to the richest people, the people who could afford those tickets, it's going to get down to wealthy private individuals. They tend to be older people. Older people have had time to save up money, and they're going to self-select themselves based on the ability and the interest, the ability to pay and the interest of going, and that has nothing to do with genetics. I mean, to a large degree.
Yeah, you might be right, and if that's the case, we would be setting ourselves up for less likely to be successful, in my opinion. So I mean, I guess it matters whether we're talking about people going and visiting versus like who is establishing a new long-term settlement, right? So
Scott,
yeah, go ahead.
You got to bear in mind, there's 8.8 billion people on Earth, and there's about 75 million millionaires. Immigration is going to be the cause of population growth rather than natural growth for goodness, probably, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years before the immigration, before natural growth is going to catch up with immigration. So the whole discussion about evolutionary theory, you need to be very careful because typically, I mean, there's evolutionary theory is very complex and broad, but typically it's sort of law of tooth and claw, and that is if people are not able to represent themselves genetically in the next population, well, as a physician, I'm gonna try to keep people alive. I'm going to fight against that at all possibility, and with our advancement in genetic engineering, I think that could sort of determine who can survive. And so I think this idea of evolving evolutionarily in the typical sense of the term, I'm not sure that's really the evolutionary selection pressures, I don't think it's going to be very high given everything that I've mentioned.
Well, that's what the whole book is about. So I actually, no, I'd encourage you to check it out because I think one of the things that I point out. So first of all, yes, of course, we would be trying to keep people safe and healthy and live as long as they can, and that might involve gene editing technologies to do that. That's certainly already happening here on Earth, and that definitely has had an impact on the strength of natural selection. But natural selection is still operating. But you also brought up the point that the constant influx of new individuals, more immigrants coming from Earth to Mars, is likely to be a major factor. And I completely agree. And one of the things I point out is that although I have some arguments in the book for why I think we need to expect evolutionary change as a default assumption if we leave Earth, gene flow, the movement of individuals and their genes between populations, is a mechanism of evolution. And so if you do have, as you said, like this ongoing movement of new individuals coming to Mars and bringing their genes with them, that will be a major factor. Gene flow is a major factor in how humans are continuing to be affected
But
by evolution on Earth. But
but that's but that's
and it
but
will
that's not
also.
natural. That's not natural selection. I mean, gene flow is people are not selecting based on their ability to reproduce or selecting themselves based on GDP.
Right. So gene flow is there's 5 mechanisms of evolutionary change, of which natural selection is one. And in evolution, we
Okay.
often talk about this kind of tension that can happen between selection and gene flow. So basically, if you sort of think about this as I like to, describe as a simple system where you have, an island and a mainland, and that's basically what Mars and Earth can be thought of as.
Right.
Mars being the island and Earth being the mainland. If you have individuals moving from the mainland to the island, and the conditions on that island are different from in the mainland, you would expect there to be adaptation through natural selection over generations. But if there's a lot of movement back and forth, that gene flow between those populations
Right.
will minimize the ability of adaptation to take place through natural selection. So there's this kind of tension that happens between natural selection and gene flow. They're both mechanisms of evolution. Only
Right.
one of them leads to adaptation. And so, yeah, I think these are all factors that we should expect to take place. So I try to point out in the book that when I talk about evolutionary change of people beyond Earth, I'm not only talking about natural selection, but also these other mechanisms of evolution. Yeah, it's
Makes sense.
yeah, thank you.
Cool.
When you talk to general public audiences, I know you can get them interested and hyped up and everything, but do you sense that there's a real interest, a real demand for human space flight, human travel, living in space, or how do you
Yeah.
sense that? Again, getting away from a space and a techie audience, what do you assess for that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what I see is that there are folks that are absolutely fascinated by the space travel and what's happening today and the possibilities for the future. And they think a lot about it, and they're really intrigued by it. And then there are folks that I talk with that either aren't really paying close attention to what's happening with space flight, space exploration, space science, or just don't think that that is something that we should be spending time and investing resources in. And so I'm sure you've encountered folks like this too, who sort of see this as like, well, it's one or the other. And I don't see it that way. I think we can be investing in learning about the Earth and trying to protect it and trying to keep people healthy and happy here, while also exploring space and trying to understand what it would be like for us to live there, as we've been describing. So there's folks that just kind of span the whole spectrum that I talk with, and part of what I'm having fun doing is letting people know about what's going on. Like, you guys are all really plugged into kind of the current, a state of space exploration. It's fun to talk with folks who maybe aren't as aware of what's going on. And on the flip side, for folks that are really aware of what's happening in space exploration, it's fun to talk with them about how can what we're doing in biology help us to think about what our future in space might be like.
So as we start to answer a lot of the questions that you've talked about and challenges that you've brought up, what's the direct or indirect benefit back to the people still here on Earth?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think we all know about a lot of the technologies that have been developed through the space program to benefit us back on Earth. But I think one of the really interesting ideas is I'm sure you're all familiar with the overview effect, right? This idea that going to space has this profound psychological, emotional impact on people, and encourages them to see our environment as fragile and needing protection, and encourages us to see humanity is all interconnected and no borders and these kinds of things. So I'm really intrigued by how that concept might apply to people truly living beyond Earth. Would they still have that same kind of awe and wonder and an appreciation of Earth? And how would they view humanity? How would they view their connection with Earth. I think, it's easy to imagine that a few generations into living, say, on Mars, people there might not feel quite the same connection to Earth as the first folks that go and travel. And so I really wonder about that kind of psychological, emotional connection and how it might change over time. I think that's a really important aspect of what we have to understand about what would happen to future generations living beyond Earth.
Several years ago, and I never remembered the gentleman's name, but he was a UK author, and he wrote a book that I wanted to extrapolate to space. So I brought him on the show. And his book was, What Does It Take to Restart Civilization After a Catastrophe? And so I asked him to apply that to starting civilization in space. And he talked about how hard it would be for survivors of a catastrophe to make toilet paper, to make a wooden pencil, to do almost of everything that we take for granted and think of as just being something simple.
Yeah.
And so you're either going to have to do comparable things on Mars or on the moon or bring it with you. But he broke it down into the little tiny things, like you want a cup of water.
Yeah.
Have you thought about what it might take infrastructure wise and just the basic things we use like toilet paper, a pencil,
Right. Right.
mouthwash?
Hmm.
How do we start over with all of this? Because you can't bring it with you indefinitely. The cost is too much.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll tell you, I don't know how to make that stuff myself, so I'd be in trouble if I. But I would actually take that notion and I would extend it even farther, and I have done in the book and in my own work is thinking through. It's not only what do we need to be able to do in terms of our human infrastructure and our technology to sort of rebuild civilization. But we take for granted all of the, ecosystem services that nature provides for us. That, the idea that something dies and it gets decomposed and broken down and it's, returned to the environment, right? Its components are recycled. We just sort of expect that is what's going to happen, but it doesn't happen on its own. It requires an intact ecosystem in order for that to take place. And so we were talking earlier about biosphere and this idea that we could have to rebuild the ecology of Earth, or at least of some subset of it. We don't even know what all of the components are of any of our ecosystems. And we're only sort of starting to wrap our heads around the complexity of all of those interactions between species and how they perform all of these ecosystem services that we absolutely rely on. So yeah, we have to rebuild our civilization, but we also need to have an ecosystem that we can live in.
Well, we're going forward without all this information and knowledge. So I guess it's going to be a hell of a D-ride. So I know we're a little past the 90-minute point. Do you have anything to say that maybe we've forgotten to bring up or you wanted to mention or concluding comments?
Well, this has been great. I really appreciate all your questions. You guys have thought about this, a lot, and I love all of the, the challenging questions that you've had for me and the new ideas. I think here's the thing. Like what I see is this is such an exciting moment because we're talking about things that were science fiction until very recently, and now we're talking about hang on. People are working on making this happen. So I think on the one hand, that's super exciting. On the other hand, let's make sure we are moving forward, as we've been saying, knowing what we're getting ourselves into. I'm excited about the future of space exploration, but I also, care about, human well-being and the well-being of other species too. So I think, let's do all the science. Let's learn as much as we can about how the conditions of space affect ourselves and affect others, and what it would really be like and take to do this. So I'm excited, but I'm also hoping that we can have answers to these questions in the not too distant future, so that we can go forward knowing what to expect.
His book is Becoming Martian. It's out on the 17th of this month. How living in space will change our bodies and our minds. Does anybody have a closing comment or question for Scott?
A comment for Scott, just in regards to ecology in mid-biosphere 2. I think we need to be careful about how we think about ecology in space settlements. And that is, if you use the idea, which I've heard space ecologists use it before, and that is look at what services ecology gives us on Earth, and we're going to have to reproduce those services. In other words, we're going to have to make Biosphere 2 work, with the relationships between the species. And I just don't think that's true. If you think about like hunter-gatherers and what ecological services nature supplied, it supplies nuts and fruits in the forest. Without agriculture, some animals that they can hunt. But when agriculture came along, we took specific aspects that nature provided, and we just took total control in the form of farming. And yes, there is some ecology at the sort of microbial level to keep that going. But I think, for example, space farming and the various life support, I think that can be done physiochemically. I'm not sure we have to, at least early on, I don't think we need to figure out some complex biosphere sort of to relationships between species before we can figure out how to grow food.
Yeah, so you make some good points about ways in which our agriculture can be greatly simplified, right? And you guys will have to have me on another time to talk about the, research that I've done on agriculture in insects, because this is actually what my PhD research was on, is looking at how ants have been growing fungi as a crop for the last 66 million years, and the complex interactions between the ants and the fungi that they're growing, and they're using bacteria to produce antibiotics to keep disease at bay. So we're not the only species that has figured out how to grow their own food and manage some of the issues that come up with, like, raising crops in a monoculture, for example. So yeah, there's ways in which our agricultural systems are very simplified ecosystems. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make, and why I still think ecology is going to be central to, sort of space settlement, is even our agricultural systems still rely on, a steady supply of carbon dioxide. And, you pointed out microbes being a huge part, and I get into that in the book quite a bit. Pollinators, right? I mean, there's some crops that we grow that don't require insect pollinators or other species as pollinators, but the vast majority still do. So, we're still so connected with nature in ways that we don't always even think about or appreciate. And so, yeah, I think we might be able to simplify that. There might be ways in which we can kind of, circumvent and bypass some of those. But, more and more we just realize how we are a part of nature. And I think, the COVID pandemic was a reminder of that. We are sort of at the whims of nature more than we like to let on or acknowledge. But, it's certainly true on Earth. I think we will be, anywhere we go to a certain extent.
Scott, thank you again for being with us, and for everyone here being with us on the space show. And remember, our next program is Tuesday evening, and we will have you back on. It was interesting when I learned from one of our guests that ants, of course, survived the big meteor impact. And they're very hardy little creatures and have survived all of what has done in other plant life and animal life. They don't survive my can of raid, but then that's a small little population that doesn't survive that. But very interesting discussion. And thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. This has been so much fun.
Okay, and everybody have a great week. Keep looking up, and back again on the Space Show for Tuesday. Goodbye, everybody.